The Edge of Glory by Interfectorem. This story was inspired by the book The Point of Honor by Joseph Conrad. Set during the Napoleonic era, I was very inspired by that book and even the near-perfect movie representation called The Duelists by Ridley Scott. Either way, my intention with this fic is to bring a great book to a wider audience like I did with my fic, Why We Fight, and parallel some of the themes in a fun Fallout atmosphere. Hope y'all enjoy. Intro. Edward Sallow, better known simply as Caesar or Kaiser, was a man from California who brought the knowledge of his people to the tribes of the East many years ago. Upon finding he and his party in a dire situation, he used the ancient knowledge and tactics of a long-dead empire to save himself and others from tribal captivity. Even though that was the spark that led to a near lifetime of conquest and atrocity, we can look back on the past of the Legion objectively and say that their conquest over 40 years led to changes and adaptations for people all across the post-Holocaust world. As barbaric as they were, their rapid conquest across the Southwest speaks volumes about their society as a whole. Being a warlike society, many analysts find one of the most interesting things about them being their goal of bringing civilization to the tribes they conquered through each one's brutal absorption into the Legion. As many look upon the Legion as simple raiders, slavers, or savages from the outside, there was a culture and standard held within their ranks that unified almost all within the society. Where Caesar thought he could eradicate individuality for a strictly utilitarian nation, there were some things that couldn't be replaced even by indoctrination. With the broad goal of Caesar's Legion being civilization at any brutal cost, it should be no surprise that the Legion sought to rid its conquests of all their old identities and install them as a cog within the national machine. However, even adhering to strict doctrine and procedure doesn't eliminate certain people's instinctive desire to stand out from the crowd or even back down from an insult. This is especially when that insult was directed at one's loyalty to the emperor. Even though Caesar saw dueling primarily as a behavior of the uncivilized, there was a legendary display of the old tribal spirit of prestige within the ranks that inspired a sense of courage and commitment for the lower legionaries that couldn't be obtained through philosophical propaganda. That inspiration came from two officers of the Legion who both loved Caesar, but upon meeting the other, knew that their glory to the emperor could only be shown by the edge of a machete. Act 1. Procedural Quarrel. Though the story had been told many times and twisted countless ways by legionaries across the Southwest, the origin of the quarrel still remains uncertain. Although, the spirit of the tale and names of the two involved remain the same, and no matter the iteration, every version heard will tell you it started south of a formerly sprawling metropolis called Phoenix, near a recently Legion-claimed settlement called Gold Canyon. Decanus Aleron was a veteran member of the staff for Centurion Therakos, 6th century, 4th cohort of the Legion. Decanus Aleron and the rest of the 6th century had been encamped outside the township of Gold Canyon for several weeks, awaiting the arrival of their new elite commander, who would lead the march against the Ajones of southern Arizona. The date was January 11th, 2262, when the cold winds of the season stirred around Aleron's feet outside the town. Aleron stepped forward to continue his assignment. His task was to serve a warrant of detainment against another officer of the 6th, Decanus Montano. The man entered the town to a tense air, as the older residents of town looked in the direction of the tall man bedecked in crimson and black. Many raised their eyebrows in worry or curiosity at the man in full armor, face covering, and a tall plume of black and red feathers lining his helmet. Most legionaries who'd entered the town weren't armed, not out of procedure, but because the idle century hadn't the need to equip themselves for battle while they were anywhere near the sleepy town. The people saw the Decanus walking with a purpose, and every resident in town seemed to know the reason he was there since the previous night's incident was known to everyone Legion and otherwise by that point. Not a sound was made other than the slight jingle of the officer's black metal armor beneath the slow winds of an Arizona morning. Stopping outside the Gold Canyon home, Decanus Aleron knew he'd find his assignment's target. The rest of the town looked the other way and continued to go about their business as the door was tapped 3 loud times with a studded gloved fist. The scrapwood door creaked open still locked by a chain when a young tribal woman peered through the opening. Can I help you, legionary?" said the slim little woman on the other side of the door. "That's Decanus, resident. I'm here for Decanus Montano. I know he's here, so open the door," said Alaron in his gruff but less hostile way he used when speaking to non-legion people of the wasteland. The woman shrank back, but didn't dare close the door as she said, He's not here. He went to stay at Lizzie Perez's home last night. I haven't seen him. You are a liar. Do not test me, woman. I have 3 accounts from 2 Decani and your prime local officials saying otherwise. Now, open this door or you will be involved in this matter as well," ordered Decanus Alaron, not willing to tolerate any games from anyone, especially a dissolute woman. With a slight shake, the woman closed the door just enough to unlock the chain without being deemed disobedient to one of the occupiers of her home settlement. In one motion, the tall officer stepped through the door and removed his black ceramic face mask to take in the quaint, dim little home. His eyes landed on the only closed door next to the meager little kitchen corner when he asked the woman, "Is he in there?" The Decanus waited for longer than he was accustomed to for an answer before the slim woman replied, That's just the pantry." "I asked if he was in there, not what room it was," interrupted Aileron before the young woman had a chance to lie even more. "I tell you, sir," said the woman with a plead and nearly a cry, but Decanus Alaron wouldn't allow it as he thundered, "He's at Lizzie Perez's home. I'll pay no regard to your words since I see his equipment all over this pitiful home." With eyes shifting between the scattered articles of Legion equipment around the musty room, Decanus Alaron felt the ingrained action of disciplining what he saw as a slave begin to arise in him. That was until he heard a shuffling sound behind the only closed door in the home. Alaron felt the strange sensation of what might have been considered embarrassment for the Decanus, who appeared to be acting like a pre-training recruit legionary or tribal auxiliary by the way he hid. Although Alaron was mistaken, since shortly after hearing the noise, a rough, "Clara, tell whoever's out there to go away," sounded from behind the closed door. Not sure what to do, knowing that Alaron found his assignment kept him from going off on the young tribal woman apparently named Clara. Alaron stormed across the small home to the closed door, opened it, and saw Montano not in a pantry, but a bedroom. As much as Alaron despised being lied to by dissolutes in even the smallest of ways, he watched the Decanus he was there to apprehend rubbing sleep from his eyes on the straw bed in only his red tunic. When seeing who was in the doorway, Decanus, Montano, sat himself up, not out of shame, but out of stern curiosity. Before Alaron could address his brother in rank and arms, Montano demanded, "What cause have you to interrupt my time in respite, Decanus?" Unsure of how to handle his assigned task and the setting he was to carry it out in, Alaron grabbed the nearest article of clothing, the black leather kilt on a table near the door, and tossed it at Montano, saying, "Dress yourself, Decanus. I am to take you to Centurion Therakos immediately." With the garment landing on Montano's lap, the half-dressed man wasn't quite satisfied with the disregard of his inquiry and demanded again, "What is this about?" "I will not disobey Centurion Therakos, but I will disobey the word from the supposed messenger who makes demands of me without cause. Now, Decanus, what specifically are your orders from our centurion?" While Montano threw on whatever articles of uniform were near him, Alaron stood himself upright even further, vision entirely focused on his task. Alaron began, "I am under orders from Centurion Therakos to take you to him under arrest for the consumption of alcohol, confirmed by 2 reputable witnesses, and—" Montano stopped what he was doing and stared at Decanus Alaron with death in his eyes at the first allegation. Before Alaron could speak any further, Montano roared, "Alcohol? Who the fucking Kaisar's name would accuse me of such insolent nonsense?" Alaron continued with the list of reasons after the outburst, without even pulling out his orders paper, and defaming the name of the Legion in presence of citizens of the Empire. The steam was visibly pouring from Decanus Montano's ears as he struggled to contain the rage and dishonor brought against his name and rank, even at the accusation level. But even worse, Montano couldn't stand the words coming from a man of his rank. Whether Alaron's words were procedure or otherwise didn't matter. Alaron didn't answer another question of Montano, You failed to answer another question of mine, Decanus. I demand to know who brought the accusation of alcohol consumption against me. Who are these two reputable witnesses of yours? Without waver of voice or tone, Alaron replied militarily, Decanus Maximo of the 3rd Contubernium and Decanus Wellion of the 2nd. As soon as the names were uttered, Montano interjected, You must be gravely mistaken, for the two names you say are those who accompanied me last night in our joint respite. Alaron stated coolly, I am not aware of the details. I am just under orders to bring you to Centurion Theracos. Well, let me inform you of the details, Decanus, said Montano, before continuing without affirmation from Alaron. In the common house of this pitiful town, I was given drink by the women here due to our shared demand for hydration after yesterday's patrol of the Mesa Hollows. What those two failed to inform you was that the three of us were poisoned when our demand for drink was confused for the indulgences of the savage dissolutes. After realization, the three of us sought retribution and achieved what was originally expected. They are as much to blame as me, even for such an incident. Stone-faced, Decanus Alaron responded, Decanus Maximo and Wellion are in camp now for exactly as you describe. I do not care for the particulars. I am still to bring you to Centurion Theracos for it, and reason number 2. Montano, cringing at the idea that the second accusation, struggled to contain his rage as he asked, And who are your witnesses for the absurd and outright offensive notion that I would ever defame the name of the Legion? Decanus Alaron was never one to explain the orders he was carrying out for his centurion, but the belligerent and defensive nature of Decanus Montano had seemingly ignited something in Alaron's brain. He felt compelled to justify his orders even further when he answered, 3 witnesses for your second allegation. The local supplier of sustenance known as Dale, the local supplier of armor maintenance equipment known as Regis, and the prime local official for this township called Old Man Grevsky, all of which were there for the events after your previous charge. Decanus Montano was left in pure shock at the names mentioned and how they could in any way serve as witnesses for the charge of defaming the Legion. With the incident of the night before flashing through Montano's mind and the correlation between that and the witnesses, his eyes were purely on the man delivering the news. Montano asked in disgust, And do you consider these men to be reputable witnesses? Unwavering, Alaron stated. What I believe is irrelevant, but was cut off. Again, overwhelmed by the situation, Montano could only shout, And since when do we take the word of such pathetic wastrels? My orders are my said Alaron, only to be interrupted again by Montano, growing increasingly upset by the predicament. I know your orders. What I fail to understand is how these charges were brought upon me, said Montano before explaining the situation further to Alaron, who'd been there strictly out of procedure. The alcohol had absolutely nothing to do with my actions last night. In the common house, I overheard the governor, Mr. Grevsky, speaking with his ignorant and out-of-place daughter, Bailey, about disparaging notions towards the Legion. Mr. Grevsky allowed for such insolent speech to continue, and I reprimanded her. Despite her injury, any woman, especially a profligate woman such as her, deserved crucifixion for the things I heard, making my actions last night more of a warning than anything. And now, you and Centurion Theracos have the nerve to place me under arrest for defending the name of Lord Kaisar in the presence of such dissolutes. Then, you take their word in how I was the one who defamed Lord Kaisar. Alaron heard every word, processed every word, and understood the savagery towards the situation that Montano proclaimed. Still, Alaron was Legion through and through, so the directive of his centurion was paramount to anything except the word of Caesar himself. Alaron could only say, Regardless the situation, I have my orders. You are to come with me to Centurion Theracos back at camp. Montano stared at the armored Alaron for a long time, completely understanding the directive, but with a mind still unable to grasp the injustice being done to him through allegation. Montano felt done with this situation and was ready to go, having completely dressed aside from his armor. He stood from the bed and said, Fine, I will have a word with Centurion Theracos about his disposition towards the words of profligates. Let us go. Decanus, gesturing for the name of the messenger. Alaron. said the junior member of the Centurion's staff as he stepped forward. Alaron felt satisfied that his job was seemingly ready to be carried out easily from that point forward. But as he stepped toward Montano, Montano's face became confused. Montano didn't know what was happening as Alaron stepped forward until Alaron unhooked the shackles from his back. Montano could identify the jingling of shackles anywhere, and all sense of concluding the matter ended in the mind of Alaron as he was shoved violently into the wall. As Alaron stumbled against the wall for balance, he caught sight of the tribal woman standing in the doorway nearly hyperventilating. When Alaron caught his balance and refocused on the man who shoved him, Montano thundered louder than before, "I will not be brought to the feet of my centurion who I serve dutifully like a damn slave." Alaron held the shackles at his side, watching the Decanus, and feeling a sudden inferno in his heart. Alaron had heard everything Montano said, agreed with him on all of it, but the roaring fire in the face of defiance to his orders made he himself roar. "My orders are what they are. How dare you defy the orders of Centurion Therakos, Montano? You speak of my defiance to orders when you act on those stemming from corrupted wastrels. I in no way defy the word of Centurion Therakos. I am defying the slave treatment from a man who acts on behalf of dissolutes," shouted Decanus Montano. Alaron roared, "Your words here and now are in direct defiance of Centurion Therakos, the word of Caesar in this place. My orders are to take you in how I was directed. That means you're coming with." Montano shouted back, "My loyalty is to Caesar, not to anyone who's been led astray by any wasters." Patience having long since vanished, Alaron cried, "You're coming in as directed," and stepped forth shackles in hand, only to feel the blade of a machete placed just above his chest plate, following the slightly rusted and dry-blooded blade from his neck to the hilt, then to the unarmored Decanus holding it. Decanus Alaron felt something even more unique get shocked back to life inside him. Alaron's eyes met Decanus Montano's, and the man who'd slept in the home of the young tribal woman, named Clara spat living flame, as he reignited the spirit of something that was thought to have been scrubbed out of them by service to Caesar. That spirit came in the form of Montano's new directive. "Into the yard, now." Without any hesitation or words, Alaron began stripping his armor as the duo civilly walked out the side door of the shack, ignoring the woman's shouting protests that might as well have been muted. Stepping into the dusty little lot connected to the house and enclosed by a 4-feet-tall stone fence, the images of the past danced across both men's eyes. Alaron and Montano both remembered being only 10 years old in their former tribes. They saw the clash of blunt steel between the members of their old tribes. Countless times, both had seen men brawling in the sands, between brother and brother, for minor and major reasons. To the death, till first blood, the duo had seen it all, and had believed for so long that dueling was something that Caesar had saved them from having to do. Born into the societies of tribes that had been annihilated and absorbed by the master they now served, both were dedicated entirely to Caesar. However, the situation, setting, offenses, misunderstandings, dedication to orders, and who they were carrying out their orders for, created a resurfacing of ancestral tradition that could only be settled in blood. No amount of brainwashing or love towards their new masters and doctrine could quell the ancestral fighting spirit that only took on new meaning in the question of who was loyal to what in their new beloved war society. As Alaron finished taking off his equipment, Montano hopped the fence and caught a passing old woman of the town by the collar. Hauling her to the edge of the stone wall, the murderous flaming eyes of Montano prevented the elderly woman from giving even the weakest of shouts until she was in her spot. The woman gripped her pail of water for comfort in the confusion, only for the young Decanus to kick it out of her hands and order her, "Do not leave this spot, woman. You'll serve as a reputable witness, while I show this profligate lover what loyalty looks like." Montano hopped back over the wall, drew his blade, and stole a glance to ensure his witness to the fight didn't move. She wouldn't even think of moving until ordered to by the blood-frenzied Decanus. At that point, Alaron had removed all his armor, minus the belt that held his machete. Alaron looked back towards the young woman, still protesting weakly, and pacing back and forth. Having been taken over by the ancestral spirit of personal combat, the two didn't care that they didn't have the Legion demanded 2 male witnesses for personal combat. After all, personal combat in even the smallest legion arenas were between slaves, or a legionary and slave, never between brothers of the same rank unless usurping a praetorian. However, it should go without saying that the particulars of legion procedure weren't a top priority in their eyes at this point, despite being the original reason for what was about to happen. Montano and Alaron stepped towards each other, weapons drawn, and looked into the other's eyes. The wind slowed, almost slow enough for the two to hear the continuing protests of Clara or the confused questions of the elderly woman, and they both shouted, "Begin!" at the same time. The first to swing was Montano, having the ferocity of a Gila beast. Alaron remained cool and level-headed, knowing his opponent's swings were fueled by rage, although Alaron had his own rage against his defiant target since the buildup of the repressed tribal tradition craved a bloody outcome that he had to keep from controlling his actions. Despite this additional internal battle, Alaron was able to hold his own, playing expertly on the defensive as Montano continued unleashing his untethered rage. Alaron blocked swing after swing from the savage attacks of Montano, feeling himself get pushed back steadily towards the shack. Remembering his placement, he thought the woman would have the sense to get out of the way if he was pushed toward her, but couldn't think about much more than where the house was as he blocked each and every swing. 40 seconds in, and Alaron could feel the presence of the home behind him, but knew not to look back, for any shift in focus would mean his end by the lightning attacks from Montano. Montano unknowingly aided his enemy when the grin on his face widened at the sight of his opponent, about to be driven into the wall. Alaron saw this and truly realized for the first time ever why he and his fellow legionaries were instructed to cover their faces in combat. Because of that, Alaron knew his placement for sure, and turned his disadvantage into an advantage. Alaron did so by risking it all during one of Montano's swings where he shot toward the man, seized his arm, and jammed Montano into the wall. The sudden switch in position wasn't expected by Montano, and this was where any combat game they were playing turned into the savage conflict both were used to in the Legion. Barely a minute in, there were no signs of either tiring. Alaron had caught Montano against the wall of the shack, but was unable to bring up his machete to finish the work. Alaron slammed his free elbow into the jaw and neck of Montano, who spat and head-butted Alaron as the blood burned hotter. In one motion, Montano seized a gap and slashed the arm of Alaron, who didn't even wince at the spray of blood. Montano attempted to expand upon his work, but overextended himself as he tripped Alaron, causing Alaron to grip the man's arm, dragging Montano to the dirt with him. Not even the sudden change in the location of the battle stopped the two. The dust kicked up, blinding both men as they swung and hacked at each other, while each duelist attempted to stand. No goggles, no protection from the elements. Not even the sand in their eyes would cause either of them to shut an eye while the sandy lot was dotted with more and more hacks from their blades. Both resorted to throwing handfuls of sand in the other's eyes between each swing, only for the clash of steel to continue in the ugliest brawl to ever happen between two officers of the Legion. As Alaron shuffled away, playing on the defensive again, Montano incessantly slapped the ground with his blade, just narrowly missing Alaron's torso or legs each time. Time had been lost when Alaron attempted to stand, just for Montano to swipe Alaron's leg out from under him. Instead of seizing the moment, Montano's ferocity had finally succumbed to exhaustion and a mouth drier than the sands they fought in. Alaron felt the blood trickle down his arm after getting floored, and stood himself back up as Montano did the same. When both had staggered to their feet, it only took one exchange and looks for the brawl to continue. A new wave of energy came over the two, and Montano began his merciless offensive again. Back on the defensive once more, Alaron found his footing again and blocked or dodged each swing. Neither had realized the elements or their own conditions, and the fight entered its third minute, as the scene looked more like two sand monsters battling, rather than two Legion officers. Swing, slash, and thrust continued perpetually by Montano, as each one was deflected or averted by Alaron. Each block, dodge, and attack became weaker as their mortal bodies rapidly lost their ability to continue. Alaron was almost pushed entirely towards the stone fence, where the woman stood when the final savage attack came crashing down with Montano's machete. Destiny had finally taken over, as that first last attack was on Montano's part, not Alaron's. With one last exhausted block, the final attack of Montano was brought about by the final attack of Alaron. One deafening clash of steel, one shoulder to Montano's chest, and Alaron whipped his blade out from under the captured arm of Montano and left one long streak of blood across Decanus Montano's torso. Shocked and not even feeling what happened, the sand-covered face of Alaron told Montano exactly what happened. Montano took 3 steps back and felt the long bloody line across his torso. The blood trickled down slowly at first until the layer of sand was broken. Then it turned to a pour. The world elements of exhaustion and thirst caught up to both of them, and as more blood poured from Montano's torso, Alaron felt his bleeding arm and knew the lesser severity of his injury didn't necessarily mean victory. More and more blood poured down Montano's torso, and neither one knew what to make of anything, since neither felt the need to proceed in the ensuing silence. Just then, victory was announced when Montano collapsed into the patch of hot blood and sand around him, and Alaron's victory speech consisted only of the words, "What have I done?" Such a simple assignment. The adrenaline of the moment had finally began to fade, and with that came the return of clarity after the heat of battle. The world finally began to spin after stopping in its rotation for the two's conflict, and the shriek of a woman entered the ears of the only man standing, Decanus Alaron. The realization of what happened between the two caught up to him, and he watched the man silently bleeding out face down in the sand. At the shriek of the woman, Decanus Alaron spurred into action with the words, "Bring Decanus Montano to me," coming from the voice of his Centurion Therakos. Slamming himself in the dirt beside the man he put there, Decanus Alaron instantly turned Montano over, whose pale face was noticed despite the layer of sand covering it. Decanus Alaron checked Montano's pulse and began pouring water atop the blood river pooling across the fallen's chest. Just then, he came under attack. A light object slammed into Decanus Alaron, but the unexpected assault was enough to knock him onto the work he was doing to heal his victim. Disoriented, Decanus Alaron felt hit after hit pummel his arms, back, and head as he realigned his focus, only to be shocked when he saw the source. The slim tribal girl named Clara incessantly hit Alaron while the shrieking voice of incoherent shouts pierced his ears. Puzzled by the assault and panicked by the deed he'd done to his fellow Decanus, Alaron stood himself up and grabbed the 2 fists hitting him in one hand. Despite being subdued, the woman didn't stop. The loss of her ability to punch only meant she'd kick and frail even more. The limp little legs of the woman smacked Alaron's shin plates regardless of how limited they were against steel. Alaron didn't know what to do as he saw the tears pouring down Clara's face, and her shouts started making sense when he saw the bleeding man start coughing up blood out of the corner of his eye. It didn't make sense at all. Alaron was trying to heal the man he nearly killed, and the woman sobbing about the matter wouldn't allow him to do so. "You killed him," entered Alaron's ears as he felt each kick from the crying, subdued woman. It didn't make any sense, and Decanus Alaron said with a timidity he didn't even think he had, "I didn't, please. Let me help him. I'm trying to help him now. The fight is over." No use. There was no end to the frantic flailing of the restrained woman, though the shouts were becoming more and more weakened by sobs and exhaustion. Montano hacked up more blood from his spot on the ground, and Alaron didn't know if it was his imagination or reality that showed an even paler face after stealing a glimpse. Panicked, Alaron didn't know what to do as he begged the woman in the same soft tone, "If I let you go, will you run to get help?" The question seemingly did little more than create a new wind of shouting and more kicking, and Alaron felt lost. The new energy from the woman almost made him lose his grip. Shuffling to regain it, he saw the elderly woman Montano grabbed as a witness still standing by the stone wall with a face paler than Montano's. Just as he regained his grip on the young woman, he tried to shout for the woman to help, but his sand-coated throat prevented him from doing so, making the situation worsen even more. Alaron felt lost, and wished he had a directive from his centurion or Caesar himself on what to do when relief came in a way he didn't expect. A commanding voice pierced the noise of the screaming woman. "Decanus Alaron, what is the meaning of this?" Almost immediately, the woman was pulled from his grip and into the arms of a large masked man in crimson and black. Not even caring why or how his struggle came to an end, he turned to see another helmeted Decanus of the Legion approach with a tall fan of feathers and 2 legionaries who picked up their pace to seize Montano upon directive. Finally feeling relieved, Alaron poured the canteen he had down his throat, watching the Decanus approach. Hopping over the stone wall, the approaching Decanus lowered his red bandana to expose the face of the senior veteran of Centurion Thericos' staff, Decanus Gula. Alaron was so relieved to see the second in command of the 6th that he didn't even consider the scene he arrived to. Stopping inches from Alaron, and before he could give his Ave, true to Caesar, Alaron felt the backhand of Gula crack against his exposed face. There in the dirt, Alaron saw the legionaries treating Montano and turned to the source of his sudden relocation to the ground. Decanus Gula roared, "Thericos ordered you to bring in Montano, not kill him." Propping himself onto one arm, Alaron said, "I didn't. I don't think I did. He challenged me to a duel." Before Alaron could explain any further, he was interrupted by a sharp kick in his side and the words, "And you agreed." There was no answering that question. Alaron knew he was in the wrong one way or the other, and wasn't even given the chance as Gula shouted at one of the legionaries, "He alive." One of the masked faces next to Montano held up his hand and shouted, "Yes, Decanus, still breathing, blood stopping." Alaron recovered from the kick, but still didn't dare to get up unless directed by his senior. He saw the young woman completely limp in the large legionary's arms, and the 2 still wrapping his wounds. Upon turning back to the senior who towered over him, Decanus Gula looked from Clara to Alaron and said, "Such a simple assignment. I fail to see how a simple detainment could lead to nearly killing one of your brothers in rank and arms, and what I can only assume to be an attempted rape of one of the locals." Alaron sat himself up again. "Gula, you are mistaken. The 2 women here were witnesses to our duel, and nothing more. My attempts to assist Montano after the mutual combat were prevented by that bobcat's assault on me." Gula saw the woman passed out in the large legionary's arms, and was about to ask where the other woman witness was when his eyes landed on the frail little woman half hidden by the wall, but still unmoving, from the spot Montano placed her 10 minutes before. Without word, Gula stormed toward the old woman, and began speaking with her. Still on the ground, Alaron took in the scene again, and asked himself again, "What have I done?" but with a new question added, "What's to come of this?" A minute or 2 later, Gula barked an indistinct set of orders at the 2 legionaries beside Montano. Instantly, the 2 propped up the critically wounded man. Upon stumbling the wounded to his feet, one of the legionaries grabbed up Alaron as Gula marched past with a simple but stern, "Follow, directive." Alaron's arm still bled, as he was helped along by the legionary. Once Alaron adjusted to walking again after the corrective assault by Gula, the other legionary moved to assist Montano's crutch in helping the half-dead man along. There, the 2 legionaries, Montano, Alaron, and the large legionary with an unconscious young woman on his back followed Decanus Gula back to the Legion's camp outside Gold Canyon with a frail old woman hobbling along to serve as a witness to the simple assignment gone horribly wrong. What came of it? Days later, Decanus Alaron awoke to the early morning sun, having almost forgotten the whole ordeal by the treatments to his arm, and after only a brief interrogation by his centurion. With the event seemingly settled by the routine of standard procedure in the waiting camp, the whole duel seemed nothing but a bad memory. Except there was one flaw that neither Alaron or Montano could place. Montano had only recently become able to speak and think properly after losing so much blood in the fight, and Alaron's injuries required little more than a wrap and a day or 2 of healing. Although the thing that couldn't be placed was largely in Alaron's mind, and that was because he was recovered enough to even think about it. That big question in the victor's mind was, why haven't I been punished? Aside from the brief interrogation from Centurion Therakos, that was it. Perhaps there was something else. In any event, Alaron awoke one morning and made his way to the mess tent. Days had already passed without any mention of the incident, despite one bed in the healing tent being occupied since the matter. Alaron thought about the words of his centurion frequently, and how little care was in any of them. Therakos had asked for Alaron's description of what happened and nothing more, only to be relieved by the next conscious interviewee. That next one happened to be the elderly woman, who may not have even been able to see the duel due to the slight clouding in her eyes. Next after her was the young woman named Claire after she regained consciousness. Alaron knew that the word of elderly or illogically aggressive women was of little regard for his centurion. Although, the question of what was to come of him really occupied his mind late at night on the day of the incident, when Montano had gained enough consciousness to give his account. Still, Alaron saw his centurion walk from the healing tent, look him over, and proceed onward without anything to be said. This only made Alaron ready for his punishment, ready for retribution, and ready for something that didn't come that night. It didn't come the next night, or the next night, or the next night either. Finally, Alaron's mind was pulled to so many different procedural places throughout the uneventful days he believed that life had simply moved on. A belief that was unheard of in the Legion, especially for an incident such as the duel. Although, on his way to the mess tent, that fourth morning after the unpunished event, Alaron was pulled aside by Decanus Gula. The two talked about everything that was according to camp routine. Questions were all about the readiness of this and that contubernium. Reports on trails and activities south of the camp, or even about the Ajones who'd supposedly been seen only a few miles south of Gold Canyon. Finally, the memory of what had been plaguing his subconscious hit Alaron in an instant, and he asked Decanus Gula, "And what is the status of Decanus Montano?" The veteran Decanus Gula merely lifted his eyes from the patrol maps, curious at his subordinate's inquiry as he asked, "You hadn't visited your brother?" Alaron, a legionary his whole memorable life, said, "No, I was not sure I could." Gula smirked. "Makes sense, I suppose. Centurion Therakos himself has been waiting for instruction on how to proceed. Well, go see Montano, if he's still conscious." The two closed out their meeting moments later, but Alaron wondered what his senior was saying. He didn't understand how Therakos himself was waiting on instruction for how to proceed. Hearing those words over and over again, Alaron knew that the issue wasn't over and was only waiting for his part in how to proceed. He wondered how it could be settled, but recalled the perplexities of Gula and how he hadn't visited Montano yet. Immediately after his breakfast, Alaron acted upon the issue that was only thought to have passed. Entering the healing tent of the 6th camp, Decanus Alaron thought how he'd never had to be in there as he studied the lone man on a cot in the center. He approached the cot and blanket-covered man, wishing he could see the damage he'd done to him without disturbance. He watched the calm face of Montano breathe in and out deeply and peacefully, knowing firsthand how vicious that face could become at perceived insult alone. Suddenly, Alaron turned around to the sound of the entryway opening. The noise and entry of someone new startled Alaron, until he saw the person who entered was only the 6th century's healing mother, a hunchbacked elderly tribal slave, who upon seeing Alaron beside Montano said, "I know. Don't go ruining my hard work, you fucking dick." Alaron couldn't help but smile at that. The 6th century's healer had always held a strange place in the hearts of the legionaries under Therakos. The belligerent old woman, the granny or grandma, was most certainly a slave, but held a strange sense of defiance yet pure loyalty to her owners that was almost adored by the legionaries of the 6th, especially the officers. There was something about her that was respectable in their eyes, and the whole century allowed her character to show as an obvious exception to the general rule of slave treatment. The grandma of the 6th could get away with the kind of speech and conduct regularly that any other slave would be killed for on the first occasion. New slaves to the unit knew without any question that she was the only slave allowed to behave as such, and new legionaries knew that harsh treatment of her would only bring pain from the commanders of the 6th. The old woman shuffled over to Alaron and physically backed him away from Montano, grumbling all the while. Alaron said, "Don't worry, madame. I was only told to check in on him." "You stay here, away from Mr. Montano. Last I need is getting nailed to a pole for something one of his own fellas did after all my work." Hearing the decanus almost laugh in that bizarre way legionaries who rarely if ever laughed, she paused before adding, "You can nail me up against a pole any day, but I prefer not die in 'cause of it. Hell you in here for anyway." The old woman made the devout man chuckle for a moment, but he still came there for a reason, and that reason was to settle the matter with the man he put on that cot. "Somehow," Alaron said to the woman, "something needs to be settled here, somehow. Can you wake him?" The woman frowned, giving a long sigh before saying, "Why? Is this trash over or not? It's shit enough just treating you fucks after battles with savages, let alone making you work overtime with fights over tribal trash tight twats." Alaron thought about the slave's presumption for the cause of the fight, but knew her opinion on the matter was irrelevant to him as he said, "It wasn't about any tribal girl, Grandma. Still, I need you to wake him." The woman let loose a heavy sigh and gave a scowl before shuffling over to the bedside, pulling the covers and exposing the torso of Montano covered by still bleeding bandages. Alaron studied the damage and marveled how he could do so much even days later. Then he thought back to his own injuries and the moments of the duel. As the elderly healer shifted over to the head of the young man, Alaron asked himself again, what is to come of this? Hearing heavier breaths from the victim as the woman smacked him awake, with the amount of care you'd expect from an elderly woman forced to heal the people who enslaved her, she awoke the young and fiery decanus. With eyes fixed on the scowling old woman above him, Montano gave a pained grin in greeting to the 6th's loving grandmother, only for that grin to turn into the embodiment of viciousness, when the grandma gave him another smack accompanied by the words, "Dec who put you here wants a talk." Montano heard the words, and attempted to sit up and face the man who bested him, only to be halted by the pain of any movement around his open torso. Alaron saw this attempt at facing down an enemy, admired it even. However, both men loved Caesar, and that made them brothers, not enemies. Alaron realized this, and approached the ceiling-locked gaze of Montano, entering his vision, and beginning the matter the only way a servant of Caesar knew how engage a brother of the legion. Alaron gave his Alvi, Decanus Montano, true to Caesar, and was met with the appropriate response by Montano. Silence ensued. Alaron was there to settle the matter, somehow, and Montano didn't even know what to think as the man who put him in a bed reserved for cripples and the weak hovered in the side of his vision. Alaron couldn't think of what to say, but he certainly saw the look of brutality in the bested man's eyes. It was obvious that Montano would use the proximity of Alaron to stab him if he wasn't in so much pain and had his machete or a knife available. All Montano could do was stare at the ceiling and try to forget the temporary victor off to his side. Alaron saw the intention and thoughts of the man as well, but nothing could be settled unless spoken into existence, rather than kept in the realm of thought. Alaron saw the answer in Montano's eyes, but still asked the weakened Montano, "Is this matter settled?" There was a long silence, as Montano continued to avoid looking at the man he saw more as a slab of meat to be eaten, rather than his brother of the Legion. Although, Alaron was briefly shocked when Montano finally responded, "Am I to be punished for this?" rather than the simple no Alaron was expecting. Still, the question had weight, and the answer wasn't known to Alaron. The victor returned, "I do not know. I don't even know what is to come of my part in the affair." Alaron's answer made Montano's eyes shift briefly to Alaron. How did the victor of the duel not even know what was to come of himself? Regardless of Montano's curiosity, Montano learned the answer to the initial question himself, and his answer told Alaron the true answer to that question regardless of what each participant in the duel felt. Montano said, "Then your answer is no. This failure against Caesar isn't settled until both of us are punished." There it was. The reason Alaron hadn't been punished by his centurion was because he didn't know whether it was settled or not until speaking with the man he put there. However, the matter wasn't settled until both were punished for the incident, a form of paradox in the regular mind. But the issue in theirs was resolved itself by both men essentially admitting that their feud couldn't end until Caesar's justice was done. Something that couldn't happen until both stated to the other, "We aren't allowed to settle things." Alaron knew what he had to do, and left the hospital tent only to be confronted by Gula waiting outside. No words on Alaron's part. He knew Gula had set this up, and was ready to be brought to the feet of his centurion when the word follow was given by Gula. Gula marched with Alaron across the camp. Both men's eyes were fixed straight ahead, and nothing was worth uttering as they approached the large crimson tent of Centurion Therakos. Marching past the armored veteran gunner out front and ducking through the tent flap below the banner, Alaron caught a quick glimpse of Clara, the tribal woman, glaring his way before finding himself inside the command tent of the 6th. Stepping forth, Alaron's escort halted, and Alaron himself approached the table where his commander sat. Centurion Therakos was a large man with skin scorched by the fires of 40 battles, all beneath the Arizona sun. The spiked shoulder plates of the helmetless centurion clanked slightly as the man continued filling out the papers before him, not even acknowledging Alaron's existence. Alaron stopped before the desk, put his fist to his heart, and greeted his master, Alvi Centurion, true to Caesar. Therakos said nothing, merely continuing his writing until he reached the bottom of the page. There, Centurion Therakos raised one hand to point past Alaron, and the order was understood by Decanus Gula when his response, "Yes, Centurion," entered Alaron's ears. Alaron heard the heavy footsteps of Gula's departure, but kept his eyes forward as Therakos finished his work. Alaron knew not to look at the writings of his superior, but saw the pen-holding hand of his centurion make a flourish on what looked like the bottom of the page. Immediately afterward, Alaron heard the pen be set down, and felt the eyes of Therakos, giving Alaron the cue to meet them as well. Alaron looked briefly at the scarred and burned face of his commander, as the centurion began folding the paper. In one deliberate motion, Therakos ordered Alaron, "Go on, pull up a chair, Decanus Alaron." Alaron immediately snapped to the order and pulled up one of the fold-out chairs beside the command table, placing it directly across from the centurion. Once seated, he was allowed to look at his centurion again, who had a look on his face that Alaron hadn't ever seen. It wasn't confusion, since centurions of the Legion are never confused about anything. It also wasn't pride or admiration, since Alaron wasn't worthy of either word due to his involvement in the duel. Alaron could only describe the look like the centurion was remembering something. Either way, Alaron didn't have long to ponder the conduct of his commander, since Therakos began with, "Veteran Decanus Gula told me you went to see if the matter with Montano was settled. Is it so?" Alaron answered strictly, militarily, and honestly as always, "It does not appear so, Centurion Therakos. Decanus Montano says it is not over until the both of us are punished for our failure to Caesar, and I agree with his position." The look remained, and Therakos responded by questioning Alaron. "And why are you to be punished, Alaron? The incident you described, and all the accounts I've heard seem to say you were only protecting yourself while attempting to carry out my orders." Alaron, with eyes fixed straight ahead, answered, "Because I engaged in a fight that could have been prevented by the fact I was equipped for battle before he was. I allowed the utilization of women as witnesses to an event of mutual combat, and most of all, I defied your order to bring in Montano by indulging in the tradition of savages." Therakos nodded the entire time Alaron was speaking, and when he was done, the centurion paused for a long while before finally asking another question. "Do you know why Caesar despises dueling?" Alaron answered the way he'd always known, the way he'd been taught. "Because we are all one under the bull. All one under Mars and the word of Caesar. All one against a world of dissolutes and savages." Therakos nodded again. "Correct, Decanus. The only fighting allowed between officers of the Legion is for placement in Caesar's Praetorian Guard. Neither you nor Montano are members of the Guard, so the fighting is unacceptable." Anyone reading this could be wondering how this situation and lecture was fair to Alaron. In Alaron's shoes, Some may be wondering if he was thinking how Montano should be punished worse, for apparently starting the whole thing. None of that crossed Alaron's mind. Alaron knew Legion justice, and who started an ordeal was never a concern in the least of ways. Alaron knew that he failed Caesar in one way or another, and those soldiers of the Legion have failed their lord in worse ways. Any failure was unacceptable, and always punished. Though the punishments differed depending on the crime, the idea of mercy was an alien concept in the Legion. Everything Therakos was telling Alaron was only confirming the inevitable. The only question remaining was still, what is to come of this? Therakos was the word of Caesar in that part of the Arizona wastes, and Alaron was ready and willing to accept whatever his centurion had planned to officially settle the matter when Therakos said, 50 lashes at the stake for you and Montano. Our elite commander should be here in a few days, and when he arrives, we'll be marching on the Ajones. Montano should be healed enough in a few days for the lashing, and I can't have 2 of my officers too crippled to lead in battle. Alaron left the tent of his centurion satisfied, ready to inform his victim of the means to settle the conflict. Some may wonder if the 50 lashes were too harsh on Montano's side since he'd recently had his chest opened. The answer to that is no. Not in Montano's eyes, or the eyes of anyone in the Legion. Montano understood that his wounds were his own fault for losing a battle even against his own brother. Montano was more than willing to take the punishment for failure in battle, as well as failure to Caesar. So, if 50 lashes was deemed necessary to make him, and Alaron for that matter, back in the good graces of Caesar and their brothers in the 6th, both were ready for a beating that would set the world back in order,